Hello and welcome back to the Bio 122 video lectures. This is video 25 on the cardiac cycle. And when we look at the mammalian heart, the four chambers actually contract in a particular sequence in order to generate the force to move blood through both the pulmonary and the systemic circuits. The two atrium, if you recall, are the ones that receive blood from the veins, and they actually both contract simultaneously in order to move blood from the atrium to the ventricles. The ventricles, once they are filled with blood, then also contract simultaneously, slightly after the atrium contracts, to then generate the larger force that moves blood through the arteries to the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. The contraction of the cardiac muscle is referred to as systole. You've probably heard the words diastolic and systolic in reference to blood pressure, with systolic being the higher of the two numbers that blood pressure is usually reported as. The reason is systole is where the higher pressures are being generated because of the contraction of the cardiac muscle. Because the atrium and the ventricles contract at different times, we actually have two different systoles. Atrial systole that pushes blood from the atrium into the ventricles. And then about 1 or 2 seconds later, the ventricular systole will then cause blood to be forced out of the heart through the arteries to the pulmonary and the systemic circuit. So those are why we have both a high and a low blood pressure number. Well, actually, the low blood pressure number, is because the heart has to relax in between contractions to allow it to fill back up with blood from the venous system. So the relaxation of the heart muscle is called diastole. So diastolic pressure is the low of the two. That's the lowest the pressure becomes while the heart is relaxing. So the cardiac cycle is dependent on those valves that we learned about in the previous section. The valves are one-way valves that open and close as blood goes through the heart and will prevent blood from moving the opposite direction, assuming that they're healthy valves. When the ventricles are relaxed and filling, that means that the valves from the atrium to the ventricle are open to allow blood to move through. But then when the ventricles begin to contract and they're forcing blood out of the arteries, that will automatically close the valves going back between the atrium and the ventricle, because we don't want the blood to flow the opposite direction. So when someone listens to the heart with a stethoscope and you hear that lub-dub sound, what you're actually listening to is the closing of the valves between the atrium and the ventricles. That's the lub sound. And then the slightly deeper sounding dub sound is that there's also the two semilunar valves that sit between the arteries and the ventricles, so that when the ventricle is relaxed and blood pressure is higher in the arteries, in order to prevent blood from flowing backwards from the arteries into the heart, which would be inefficient, those valves also have to close, and that's the dub sound. So that's why listening to the lub-dub sound can tell a physician quite a bit of information about the health of the heart, and that everything is contracting in the right sequence, and that the valves are healthy. Now, how does the heart actually know when to contract? It's based on electricity. So in the right atrium, there's actually what we refer to as pacemaker cells that continuously generate a rhythmic action potential or a change in electrical voltage from negative to positive. This is reflected in, it can be measured on the surface of the skin by placing electrodes around the heart and recording what's known as the electrocardiograph, either ECG or EKG, depending on whether you use the German or the English spelling for cardio. The different waves have to do with the contraction of different parts of the heart. So there's what's referred to as the P wave, which is the depolarization and contraction of the atrium. So remember, the atrium has to contract first in the cardiac cycle to move blood from the atrium to the ventricles. So the P wave needs to occur at a particular time before the much larger QRS wave, which represents the contraction of the much larger muscle in the ventricle. That's why it's such a higher amplitude. And then the T wave is when the ventricle relaxes. So the repeated measures and the timing in between the two spikes on the EKG can again tell a physician much about the health of the heart and whether everything is contracting in the right sequence. So if we look at a mammalian heart and all the different structures in it, where does the signal begin? There is in the right atrium what's referred to as the sinoatrial node. This is what normally will generate the rhythmic pattern. And that's what is noted in this first deflection here that's called the P wave. It's kind of in this purple color here is when the electrical signal starts in the sinoatrial node. That signal then spreads to both atrium through conductive tissue. And so both atrium contract together. It then goes to another node called the atrioventricular, because this node sits between the atrium and the ventricle. It actually imparts a slight delay of about 100 milliseconds or 0.1 seconds, so that there's time for the blood to move from the atrium to the ventricle. If we then go to about 100 milliseconds later, we now see the spread of the electrical signal very rapidly travels from the AV node down to the apex of the heart, so that the heart starts contracting from the point forward, because remember, the arteries are coming off the top. So the contraction of the ventricles is designed to push the blood from the bottom to the top. And all of this is reflected in the electrical signal of the EKG, as shown in this diagram. That's the end of the cardiac cycle. Have a good day.